Imagine wandering deep into the Appalachian mountains, where the trees grow so thick they block out the sun, and the silence carries an uneasy weight. Locals will tell you there are places you don't go, not because of bears or wolves, but because of what waits behind the rotting wood of forgotten shacks. Stories passed down in hushed whispers speak of a family so isolated, so cut off from the outside world, that over generations, they began to lose touch with what it even meant to look human. Their faces no longer carried the balance and symmetry we expect. Their voices came out broken, guttural, some unable to speak in words at all. Children were born with crossed eyes so severe they could hardly see straight, others with jawlines that never quite formed, mouths slack and twisted, expressions permanently vacant, as though their bodies had betrayed them long before they reached adulthood. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Most families, even in hardship, cling to pride and dignity. But this family became a secret, a living warning etched into human flesh. For outsiders who stumbled across them, it was like seeing the human form stripped of everything familiar, left only as a warped reflection of what survival in total isolation could do. What made it even more chilling was how easily this could happen, not just in faraway kingdoms of old Europe, but here, in America. In a land that prides itself on freedom and opportunity, a family slipped so far into the margins that they forgot what normal life and normal faces looked like. This story isn't simply about poverty or misfortune. It's about what happens when bloodlines collapse inward, when survival takes precedence over society, and shame forces entire towns to bury the truth. Tonight, we're going to step into the shadows of Appalachia and uncover one of its darkest secrets. The inbred family so isolated, they forgot what human faces should look like. The mountains of Appalachia have always held secrets. Settlers who first came here in the 1700s sought isolation from the world, freedom from government, war, and persecution. They carved homes into the rugged wilderness, surviving on what they could hunt, grow, or build with their own hands. But with that independence came danger. When a family found itself too far from a road, too far from trade or a church community, it was easy to vanish into a cycle of silence. The family at the center of this story, whose name is still spoken with a kind of uneasy reverence in the region, began like any other. Hard-working, determined, and fiercely protective of their land. But when illness swept through, and when neighbors left for better opportunities, this family stayed behind. Generation by generation, their circle shrank, until marriage outside the bloodline became nearly impossible. What started as cousin marrying cousin eventually collapsed into siblings and close kin, taking one another as spouses, not out of cruelty, but out of a desperation for survival and continuity. By the 1800s, locals already whispered about their appearance. Children born with drooping eyes, jaws that failed to close, or heads disproportionately shaped. A few were mute, able only to grunt or howl. Visitors who stumbled upon them described an unease that went beyond deformity. It was as if time itself had stopped at their doorstep. These were people who seemed frozen in another age, unaware of the world outside their valley, and uninterested in leaving it. But secrecy grew alongside shame. The surrounding townspeople knew of them, but refused to speak too openly. A strange code of silence hung over the hills, as though the family's condition was contagious, or worse. cursed. Teachers who saw the children in rare attempts at schooling reported strange behaviors, fixations, wild outbursts, and an inability to follow even the simplest of lessons. It became easier to look away than to confront the truth, easier to bury the story in folklore than acknowledge that such a family existed in modern America. And yet, they endured. Inbreeding did not destroy them. It preserved them, but at a cost. Their bloodline became a mirror reflecting the dangers of isolation. A mirror that outsiders, when they finally dared to look, would find almost impossible to face. The first real accounts of this family don't come from newspapers or officials. They come from travelers and neighbors who wandered too close to the edge of their land. In the mid-1800s, peddlers and surveyors moving through the Appalachian hills wrote of seeing figures watching from the tree line. Gaunt shapes that would vanish the moment a stranger tried to approach. Sometimes it was the sound that struck first. Low grunts, guttural noises, or laughter that didn't quite sound human. Folklore took root quickly. Some claimed the family wasn't fully human anymore, that they had become a kind of woodland creature, born of sin and punishment. Others swore the children were feral, running barefoot through the brush with their eyes crossed and unfocused, stumbling as though the very act of walking upright had been forgotten. To meet one was to be haunted forever by the memory. One early account tells of a schoolteacher traveling through the mountains, who stumbled upon two children by a stream. Their heads seemed misshapen, their eyes wandering in opposite directions. They made no attempt to speak, only shrieked when she called to them. The teacher fled, and later claimed she had seen something not of God. Another story, this time from a coal miner passing through, described visiting the shack and being greeted by a woman whose face drooped on one side, as though melting. She made a sound, half growl, half word, and then shut the door without another glance. It became common for locals to scare children with the tale. Stay close to home, they'd warn, or the family in the hollow will get you. But beneath the ghost stories lay the grim truth. These were not monsters. They were people, caught in a web of isolation and bloodlines so tight that their very DNA seemed to rebel against them. What frightened outsiders most was not the family's appearance, but the recognition that this was a mirror of what any community could become if cut off from the world long enough. By the turn of the 20th century, the family was already legend, and yet, for those brave or foolish enough to push into their land, legend became reality in ways they would never forget. By the early 1900s, the family had become less of a rumor and more of a quiet, shameful truth that lingered over the region. Everyone nearby knew of them, but few dared to speak aloud. To acknowledge them was to break an unspoken rule, one that had been passed down almost as long as the family itself. Outsiders who pressed too hard, who asked too many questions, were often met with silence, suspicious stares, or even subtle threats. The code was clear. Some things are not meant to be talked about. Generations within the family lived and died in the same hollow, their bloodline curling tighter, like a rope twisting back on itself. Marriages were not celebrated, but expected, between cousins, sometimes even between siblings. The children born of these unions bore the marks. Crossed eyes so severe the pupils drifted in opposite directions, mouths that hung slack and refused to form words, skin stretched too tightly over angular skulls. Some were born still, never taking a breath at all. Yet the family continued, as though trapped in a cycle that neither shame nor suffering could break. Neighbors would occasionally stumble upon them in town, appearing suddenly on dirt roads, or standing awkwardly in front of a store. They spoke little, often just staring, their presence unsettling even without words. Merchants described them as off, not just in appearance but in mannerisms, movements that seemed jerky, eyes that rarely locked onto anything. Many would rush to finish their shopping, desperate to retreat back to the hills before anyone lingered too long. But what's perhaps most haunting is how ordinary the family seemed to themselves. For them, this was life. This was normal. They did not see deformity or horror. They saw blood, kinship, and the fragile continuation of their line. Shame was carried not in their bones, but in the whispers of those outside their valley. To look into their faces was to see generations of silence carved into human flesh. The outside world preferred not to intervene. Poverty, isolation, and deformity were not unusual in the mountains. And so this family was left to fade into the shadows, hidden in plain sight. The code of silence held strong, and in that silence, the family's bloodline tightened its grip on itself, warping further with every passing generation. By the mid-20th century, America was changing fast. Highways were cut through mountains, factories spread into valleys, and rural isolation grew harder to maintain. But deep in certain pockets of Appalachia, families still clung to the old ways. It was here that photographers, social workers, and journalists began stumbling into hollows long thought forgotten, and the family hidden there could no longer remain a rumor. The photographs that emerged were shocking. Grainy black and white images showed figures with sunken cheeks, asymmetrical faces, and eyes that seemed to wander in opposite directions. Some stood stiffly, their mouths half open, as though unsure of how to hold their expressions. Others sat slouched, staring at the ground, their hands twitching nervously. These images spread quietly at first, whispered about in academic circles, then leaked into public view. For those who saw them, it was as though a legend had stepped into the light. What people once dismissed as folklore became impossible to deny. Locals who spoke, rarely and reluctantly, described strange encounters. They told of visiting the family's shack and being greeted by members who barked, grunted, or muttered incoherent sounds instead of speaking. Some recalled children chasing one another on all fours like animals, snarling and laughing in a way that froze the blood of anyone watching. Others said the silence was even worse. The stillness of faces so distorted they barely seemed alive. To outsiders, these images became symbols of tragedy, but to the people of Appalachia, they were a reminder of a secret the mountains had guarded for generations. This was not a horror story invented to scare children. It was flesh and blood, breathing in the same valleys, walking the same roads. And perhaps most haunting was the recognition. This could have been any family, given the same isolation, the same sight, lens. It was not evil, not a curse, but something much closer, something uncomfortably human. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed, carrying the shame in silence, or would you have tried to escape, knowing the world outside might never accept you? When we look at the story of this family, it's tempting to see only the grotesque, the deformities, the sounds that didn't resemble speech. But that is only the surface. What disturbs us more deeply is what their existence reveals about human fragility, about what happens when survival twists inward with no outside influence to balance it. They became not monsters, but mirrors, reflecting truths that society would rather turn away from. Psychologists who later studied cases like this described them as genetic echoes. Every face carried the history of choices, or perhaps the absence of choices. Each crooked smile, each wandering eye, was an imprint of isolation written into the body, and the silence of the community only deepened the horror. Because while this family bore the physical weight, the surrounding towns bore the moral one. They knew. They looked away. They let generations slip deeper into suffering, because to intervene would mean admitting that such a thing could exist in modern America. That silence is perhaps more haunting than the deformities themselves. It asks a question we're still not comfortable answering. How much suffering are we willing to ignore if it means keeping our own world untouched? The family became a reminder that progress is not guaranteed, that civilization is fragile, and that one wrong turn can send us spiraling back into something primitive, something uncomfortable to recognize in ourselves. For the people of Appalachia, the family became a kind of unspoken curse. Not supernatural, but human. Proof that shame can trap you just as much as mountains can. Proof that blood ties, once too tightly wound, can strangle instead of sustain. And yet, for all the discomfort, their story is one of survival. They did not vanish. They endured ridicule, silence, deformity, and fear. And still, they endured. Perhaps that is what unsettles us most, of all, that even in conditions we cannot imagine enduring, life insists on continuing, even in forms we no longer recognize as our own. The family is both a warning and a testament. A warning of what can happen when isolation turns inward, and a testament that humanity, even in its most distorted form, refuses to die. When people hear the story of this family today, the first reaction is often disbelief. Surely this cannot be real. Surely these are just legends exaggerated in the telling. But then, the photographs emerge, and the disbelief melts into silence. You look into those faces, and you realize you are staring at something both deeply human and almost unrecognizable. That unease, that tension between recognition and denial, is what gives this story its power. The family remains one of Appalachia's darkest secrets, a symbol whispered about, but rarely confronted directly. Even now, many locals refuse to speak their name. It is easier to bury the story in the soil of forgotten valleys than to admit that America, the so-called land of progress, could allow such suffering to exist unchecked for centuries. But that silence is a choice that has allowed countless dark corners of history to remain hidden in plain sight. When you peel back the folklore, when you strip away the sensational rumors, what remains is haunting in a different way. This was not a monster story. This was a story of survival, of bloodlines forced inward until they bent and broke. It was the story of a community that looked away, of shame passed down like an heirloom. It is a reminder that horror is not always born from supernatural forces, but from human neglect, from silence, and from the refusal to face what's uncomfortable. And perhaps that's the most unsettling truth of all, that the line between us and them is thinner than we care to admit. Isolation, poverty, desperation. These are not foreign to us. They are threads in our own history, threads that, under the wrong circumstances, could unravel into something just as haunting. So the next time you find yourself driving through the mountains, passing a hollow where no one seems to live anymore, remember this story. Remember the family who endured, in silence, hidden away until their very faces bore the weight of generations. And ask yourself, what other secrets lie buried in the shadows, waiting for someone to look too closely? Some stories never make the history books. They're carried in whispers, in warnings, in the uneasy silence of those who still remember. This is one of those stories, a story you were never meant to see. But now that you have, will you ever forget it?